The chamber smelled like ammonia and burnt ceremonial cloth, and I stood in the middle of it wearing a dead man's tutu. Not literally a tutu. The Virath called it a vothkeln, a garment of diminishment, woven from processed offal fiber, dyed the particular shade of blue-gray that their culture reserved for livestock and convicted criminals. It billowed at my knees. The collar scraped. The Virath Empress Regent Savathiel had ordered it fitted to my body 3 hours ago, and the drone who'd done the fitting had not spoken a single word the entire time. Not even to each other. That was 8 years ago. I am telling you this now because the Galactic Arbitration Council asked me to start at the beginning, so I am starting at the beginning. The vothkeln. The chamber that smelled like ammonia. The moment I understood, with a clarity I had never experienced before and have never fully lost since, that the Virath Empire did not believe I was a person. My name is Elias Corrigan. I was 34 years old when the Empire annexed the Kepler frontier settlements. I was a facilities coordinator for the Colonial Liaison Office. Essentially, I pushed a mop, not metaphorically. I pushed an actual mop across actual floors in the administrative hub on Kepler 7, because the atmospheric recyclers in that building had a habit of weeping condensation at the joints, and the local cleaning drones were incompatible with the floor sealant the previous administrator had imported from Earth. So I pushed a mop. I am saying this because the Virath files on record identified me as a sanitation operative, which their cultural classification matrix mapped directly to their lowest caste. A mop bearer, an instrument of waste removal, not a thinking creature, not a diplomatic contact, certainly not a witness. But witnesses are exactly what we will be discussing today. Let me back up. When the Virath fleet came through the jump corridor above Kepler 7, it came without warning, and without the minimum 12-cycle notice required under Clause 9 of the Galactic Expansion Protocol. I know this because I was in the middle of mopping the floor outside the administrator's office when the ceiling-mounted comm unit started screaming emergency tones. And Administrator Delacroix ran out of her office at a speed I had not previously believed her capable of and nearly slid straight into my bucket. "They're here," she said. "Who?" I said. "The Virath, the advanced diplomatic fleet." She gripped the door frame and stared at her comm unit as if it had personally betrayed her. "They're not supposed to be here for another 6 weeks." What I remember most about those first hours, before the Virath diplomatic team came down in their shuttle, before the briefings, before the vothkeln, is the way the people of Kepler 7 handled themselves. A colony of roughly 12,000 humans, scattered across a terraformed rock at the edge of surveyed space, with 11 minutes warning that a superpower fleet had just parked in their sky. They were scared. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But they were also methodical. The parents gathered their children. The emergency response teams deployed without being told to. Dr. Anik Voss at the settlement clinic started quietly inventorying medical supplies. The school principal, a stubborn former military man named Haruki Sato, got on the colony-wide comm system and talked to the children in the same calm voice he used for fire drills. Nobody panicked. The Virath noted this. We did not know at the time that they noted anything at all. The diplomatic team arrived at the administrative hub that afternoon. 12 Virath in ceremonial armor, the layered exoskeletal plating that senior caste members wear for formal occasions, lacquered in deep amber and the particular iridescent black that their military dyes from a beetle they cultivate on their home world. They moved in a precise geometric formation. They were extraordinary to look at, and they knew it. The formation was designed to be extraordinary to look at. What they had not counted on was Haruki Sato standing at the bottom of the administrative hub's main steps with his hands clasped behind his back, watching them come, with the same expression on his face he wore during fire drills. They asked through a translation drone who was in charge. Sato told them Administrator Delacroix was the senior colonial representative, and that he himself was the settlement emergency coordinator, and he introduced himself by name. The Vyrath diplomatic lead, a Tier 3 envoy whose name translated roughly as Voice of the Ascending Ember. Though we mostly called her the envoy, ran Sato's statement through her translation interface, and then stared at him for a moment that went on slightly too long. "You offer your personal designation," she said finally. "Yes," Sato said. "This is not a protocol we recognize." "Consider it an introduction," Sato said. "I'm Haruki, I teach children." "What's your name?" I was standing 40 feet away with a cleaning cart I hadn't had time to put down, and even from that distance I could see the envoy's secondary eyes, the lateral sensory organs the Vyrath use for threat assessment, rotate in a way that their primary eyes did not. She was recalibrating something. She did not answer the question. They never did in those early meetings. Names to the Vyrath are classified information. Personal names are shared only within caste-bonded social units. Offering your name to a stranger, especially a stranger of unclear caste status, was either an act of profound intimacy or an act of deliberate social aggression, and their translation matrices initially mapped human name exchanges to the latter. This matters enormously. I need you to understand this before I tell you what happened in the chamber. The annexation of the Kepler frontier settlements was technically legal under the expansion protocol. The Vyrath had filed the correct documentation with the Galactic Arbitration Registry 18 months earlier. The settlements fell within the contested quadrant boundary. The Human Stellar Authority had filed 3 counterclaims, all of which were still in administrative review. Because the Galactic Arbitration Registry's administrative review process operates on a timeline that, to put it diplomatically, does not prioritize urgency. So the Vyrath came, and we were technically theirs. The first 3 months were procedural, resource inventories, population assessments, caste determination hearings, which were the part that started to go wrong. The Vyrath Caste Assessment Bureau operates on a matrix that evaluates 6 categories: biological complexity, technological production capacity, social hierarchy indicators, resource generation value, historical record depth, and what they call Voth-So, which translates as ceremonial weight, essentially your species' capacity to participate in the Empire's ritual social structure. Humans scored reasonably well on biological complexity. We scored well on technological production. Our historical record depth was impressive. Actually, 10,000 years of documented civilization got us marks that surprised the assessment team, but we scored catastrophically on Voth-So. Because the primary metric for ceremonial weight is the degree to which your society operates through formal, named hierarchy, titles, designations, explicit rankings carried in your name itself. The Vyrath can read your entire social position from the suffix structure of your name. A human name like Elias Corrigan contains no such information. To the Assessment Bureau, it read as blank, uncategorized, non-hierarchical, which in their matrix mapped to the bottom caste. Not because we were unintelligent, not because we were primitive, because our names were naked. I did not understand the full mechanics of this at the time. I understood it later, sitting in the Voth kiln, with the ammonia smell and the burning cloth, putting the pieces together one by one in the way you do when you have nothing else to do with your mind. The chamber I was in was the Vyrath Frontier Administrative Hub, a temporary structure they'd erected in what used to be the northern landing field of Kepler 7. 300 meters of prefabricated Vyrath construction that smelled of their materials and their air balance systems, and the particular organic compound their lower caste workers exuded when they were stressed. It looked like authority, and it smelled like fear, and I couldn't always tell which one was mine. I had been brought there 8 months after the annexation. I had been brought there because of what I'd done with the water system. Let me explain the water system, because this is the part that matters. The Kepler-7 water reclamation network was a third-generation terraforming system, installed during the original colony setup, upgraded twice since then. It was good infrastructure. It was also, by the end of the first month of Virath administration, catastrophically incompatible with the Virath resource extraction machinery they'd started installing on the northern plateau. The extraction system was drawing rare earth compounds from the subsurface, and the runoff was seeping into the tertiary aquifer layer and working its way into the reclamation input streams. Nobody in the Virath administrative structure caught this. Their resource assessment team had evaluated the colony's water system using the same matrix they applied to Virath-built infrastructure, and it did not flag the incompatibility because the incompatibility existed at the level of system architecture, not component specifications. I caught it. I caught it because I spent 8 months with a mop in that building, and I paid attention to things. I noticed the mineral staining on the eastern corridor floor drains changing color. I noticed the filtration warning lights cycling faster. I noticed that the condensation on the walls of the lower-level maintenance corridors had started to smell faintly metallic on days when the extraction system was running at full capacity. I wrote up a technical report. I submitted it through the Colonial Liaison Channel. The Colonial Liaison Channel, 8 months into the annexation, was being processed by a Virath administrative intake AI that was not programmed to route requests from non-caste-designated personnel to technical review teams. My report went into a processing queue and stayed there. So I fixed it myself. I spent 6 weeks doing it. I requisitioned parts through the Colonial Maintenance supply chain, which was still technically operational under the annexation terms, and I rebuilt the tertiary filtration matrix by hand, component by component, working nights, because the days were taken up with the mandatory census and resettlement protocols the Virath were running. There's a specific thing that happens when you work that kind of job, the invisible kind, the one where nobody watches because nobody thinks the work matters. You start to understand systems in a way that the people who run the systems never do. The administrator sees the output. The assessment team sees the metrics. I saw the pipes. I saw where they sagged under their own weight and where the joints were stressed by thermal expansion and where someone had used the wrong sealant compound 3 years ago and it was slowly failing. I saw the whole living body of the infrastructure, every weakness and improvisation and quiet miracle of ongoing function. And I had been seeing it for 3 years before the Virath arrived. That knowledge is not something you can put in a caste matrix. There's no suffix structure in any Virath name that encodes, has spent 10,000 hours paying attention to things nobody else thought important. It just doesn't translate. So they looked at me and saw a mop bearer. They looked at my report and saw a processing queue entry. They looked at the fixed filtration system and saw an anomaly in the record. When the Virath Infrastructure Assessment Team did their quarterly review and found that the contamination issue they hadn't known existed had been resolved through modifications to the system's core architecture, they traced the work order trail back to me. That is why I was in the chamber. Not to be thanked, to be assessed. The Tier 2 infrastructure assessor who ran the hearing, a creature of immense physical presence and very little visible patience, went through the work orders one by one. He asked me, through the translation drone, to explain each modification. I explained each modification. He asked me where I had received my engineering training. I told him I hadn't. I told him I'd learned systems architecture from reading, from manuals, from paying attention. He asked me what my caste designation was. I told him I was a facilities coordinator. He asked me to clarify what that meant in Virath caste terms. I told him honestly that based on what I understood of the Virath caste matrix, I was probably classified as a sanitation operative. The secondary eyes rotated. A very long silence followed. Then they brought in the Vothkeln. I understand now that it was not meant as cruelty in the Virath conception of that word. The Vothkeln is a formal instrument of social classification. When the Assessment Bureau encounters an entity whose actions are inconsistent with their caste designation, one of the resolution mechanisms is what they call a Vothkeln ceremony, a public reclassification ritual in which the entity is garbed in the clothing of their assessed caste as a way of, to use their phrase, restoring legibility. It is functionally humiliation, but it is humiliation as bureaucracy. They genuinely believed they were being orderly. The Vothkeln was made of something that itched. The dye was uneven in a way that suggested it had been made quickly, and it hung in folds that were designed for a Virath body with a very different shoulder structure than mine. The room had 9 Virath administrative observers in it. None of them looked at me the way you look at a person. They looked at me the way you look at a filing procedure that is proceeding correctly. I stood in it for 40 minutes. I thought about a lot of things during those 40 minutes. I thought about a physics professor I'd had in my second year of college who used to say that the most dangerous thing in any system was an assumption so foundational that nobody remembered it was an assumption. I thought about the mop in the storage room outside the hearing chamber that I could see through the window in the door, leaning against the wall where I'd left it. I thought about the fact that I had fixed their water system, and they were going to put me in a costume about it. Mostly, though, I thought about names. The Tier 2 assessor filed his report. He noted that I had performed unauthorized infrastructure modifications to colonial systems under Virath jurisdiction. He noted that said modifications were technically competent. He noted that my caste designation did not account for this competency, and recommended that I be reclassified as an anomalous resource asset, pending further evaluation. He noted that as a sanitation operative demonstrating above-category skills, I represented a caste contamination risk and should be restricted from further unsupervised contact with colonial infrastructure. He did not ask me my name. He did not ask me my name because names to the Virath Assessment Bureau are not part of the evaluation matrix. You are your designation. Your designation is your caste. Your caste is your value. The name is irrelevant noise. I thought about Haruki Sato standing at the bottom of those steps. I'm Haruki. I teach children. What's your name? I thought about Dr. Voss counting her medical supplies, about the parents gathering their children in 11 minutes, about the way 12,000 people had refused to be legible in the way the Virath framework required them to be legible. I said nothing. I went back to work. That is the part they never understood, the part that did not compute in any of their matrices, assessment or otherwise. They restricted my access to colonial infrastructure. They attached a monitoring tag to my personnel file. They dressed me in a dead man's tutu and filed a report and genuinely believed that was the end of it. I went back to work. Not to the water system. I wasn't suicidal. But there is always work to do when you pay attention and everyone else is running a matrix. I started paying attention to the food. The Virath caloric provisioning system for annexed populations operates on a standardized biological minimum matrix. It provides sufficient nutrition for entities of assessed biological complexity, calibrated to the minimum necessary for maintained productivity. What it does not account for is cultural food practice. The human relationship to food is not primarily caloric. It is social, it is ritual, it is psychological. It is the specific memory of your grandmother's kitchen and the way bread smells when the yeast is right and the shared silence of a good meal after a bad day. The Virath provisioning system was technically sufficient and psychologically devastating, and the effect on the colony's 12,000 people over 8 months was a slow, grinding erosion that the Virath metrics were not measuring because they were not looking for it. I started taking notes. Not technical notes, names. I started writing down names. not as a resistance act, not at first. I wrote down names because names were the thing the Virath assessment system was specifically not equipped to process, and I had begun to understand, with the slow certainty of someone who spends a lot of time paying attention to systems, that this was their structural weakness. Not in the political sense, in the epistemological sense. They could not see what they could not categorize, and they could not categorize names, and therefore every human who told them their name was, from the Virath perspective, emitting untranslatable noise. We were, in the most functional terms, invisible. I wrote down names because I intended, eventually, for someone to hear them. I kept the notebook in a waterproof case in the tertiary filtration access shaft I'd rebuilt. One of the access panels I'd replaced had a 12-centimeter gap between the outer housing and the junction box that no Virath monitoring system was sized to detect, because no Virath system was built at that scale. I filed the notebook in the gap. I kept filing. This went on for 3 years. In those 3 years, the provisioning system's psychological toll manifested as a measurable increase in the colony's stress-related health events, which Dr. Voss documented in medical records the Virath did not have access to, which I cross-referenced with the provisioning schedule, which I noted in the notebook. Haruki Sato's emergency coordination structure quietly evolved into something that looked, from the outside, like a compliant colonial advisory body, and functioned from the inside as a 12,000-person mutual aid and information-sharing network. I was not running this. I want to be clear about that. Sato was. I was just the person who kept the notes. The envoy, voice of the ascending ember, rotated through the frontier administration twice more in those 3 years. Each time she came, she reviewed the population assessments. Each time she noted that Kepler-7's productivity metrics were declining slightly within acceptable parameters, not flagged, not investigated. What the productivity metrics measured was output, unit production, labor hours, resource processing. What they didn't measure was input. They didn't measure the energy cost of a population conducting its entire emotional life in a language the empire couldn't hear. They didn't measure the daily overhead of 12,000 people maintaining, entirely through word of mouth and memory, a shadow version of the community infrastructure the Virath had not bothered to provide. The food-sharing networks. The child watch rotations. The informal systems for identifying and supporting people who were starting to fall apart before they actually fell apart. The endless, exhausting, invisible labor of staying human under conditions that were not designed for it. I wrote all of it down. Each time the envoy came for an audit, I was called in. Each time, I wore the Vothkelm. Each time, I answered the technical questions and submitted to the assessment and said nothing that wasn't asked of me. And each time, when the technical questions were done and the assessment was filed and I was standing in the door on my way out, I said my name. Elias Corrigan, I said the first time. No response. Elias Corrigan, I said the second time. The envoy looked at me for a moment with the secondary eyes very still and said nothing. I went back to work. On the third audit, at the end of the third year, the envoy was present herself. I had never been in the same room as the envoy. She was remarkable. She was, if I am being precise, the most physically imposing creature I had ever seen, nearly 2.5 meters, the amber and black ceremonial plating of a senior diplomatic officer, a stillness in her movement that suggested not calm but coiled intensity. She watched me for a long time before she spoke. "You are the MOP operative," she said. The translation drone rendered this with a flatness that I was fairly sure was not in the original. "I'm Elias Corrigan," I said. She looked at me the way the Tier 2 assessor had looked at me when I described learning systems architecture from manuals. The secondary eyes did the rotation. "That designation is not in the assessment file," she said. "I know," I said. "Why do you state it?" "I thought about it, because I'm a person," I said, and people have names." She was quiet for a moment. "You are an anomalous resource asset," she said. "The question of personhood is a caste determination." "I know your caste determination," I said. "I was there for the assessment. I was the one in the Vothkelm." "You remember the ceremony." "I remember everything," I said. "That's a human trait. We remember things even when it's inconvenient, especially when it's inconvenient." She looked at me for a long time. The plating on her primary shoulders, the large ceremonial veins that senior caste Virath wear as social signal structures, shifted in a way I had learned, over 3 years of coexistence, meant something between recalibration and unease. She dismissed me without reclassifying me. That was the first time anything in her behavioral pattern deviated from the matrix. I went back to work. I am going to skip forward 2 years. Not because nothing happened, a great deal happened, but because what I am about to tell you is what the Galactic Arbitration Council is actually here for, and I want to arrive at it with the care it deserves. In the 5th year of the annexation, the Virath Infrastructure Authority began Phase 2 expansion on the Northern Plateau extraction operation. Phase 2 involved drilling at depths that the original assessment had designated as safe, based on geological surveys that were themselves based on survey instruments calibrated to Virath planetary formation geology. Kepler-7 is not a Virath formation. It is a 3rd-generation terraformed colony built on a base geology that is formally documented in the Colonial Stellar Authority's terraforming records, which the Virath assessment team had reviewed, and which their geological interpretation matrix had processed incorrectly. Specifically, the deep substrate of Kepler-7's northern plateau is honeycombed with a formation of bioluminescent mineral pockets that are a byproduct of the terraforming bacterial culture used in the original colony setup. These pockets are chemically inert under normal pressure conditions. At the depths Phase 2 proposed to drill, the pressure differential would compromise the pocket walls and release the mineral compound into the aquifer system. Not the tertiary aquifer, the primary aquifer, the one that feeds the colony's drinking water supply. The compound itself is not acutely toxic to humans in low concentrations. In sustained exposure over months, at the concentrations that would result from a compromised primary aquifer, it causes neurological degradation. Specifically, it impairs the neural structures responsible for long-term memory encoding. I learned this because Dr. Voss had been monitoring the tertiary aquifer incident, the one from year 1, and had pulled the historical toxicology data on the mineral compound when she noticed the bioluminescent signature in the soil samples from the northern boundary of the colony's water intake zone. She brought me the data in a folded piece of paper during a supply distribution shift in year 4, tucked under a container of filter media parts I'd requested. She pressed it into my hand and said 4 words. "Look at this tonight." I looked at it that night. I sat in the maintenance corridor for 2 hours with a headlamp and read every number 3 times. Then I went and found Dr. Voss and told her she had found something that was going to matter. She looked at me with the particular expression of someone who already knew that and was very tired about it. She showed me the data 6 weeks before Phase 2 drilling was scheduled to begin. We had 6 weeks. I wrote the report. I submitted the report. The report went into the processing queue. I escalated the report through every channel available under annexation protocols. I filed a formal protest under Clause 14b of the Galactic Expansion Protocol, which allows annexed population representatives to petition for infrastructure review on grounds of immediate biological welfare risk. The Clause 14b filing required a Virath administrative receiver to acknowledge receipt within 30 cycles. The administrative receiver assigned to the Kepler-7 file was on rotational reassignment. The backup receiver was processing a backlog from 4 other frontier annexations. The acknowledgement did not come. 4 weeks left. I called in the notebook. I went to the filtration access shaft at 2 in the morning on a day when the monitoring cycle had a 12-minute gap. I had been tracking the monitoring cycle for 2 years because I had nothing better to do at 2 in the morning, and I pulled the notebook from behind the access panel, and I sat on the floor of the maintenance corridor, and I read through 5 years of names. I will not recite all of them here. I will tell you that there were 911 of them. People who had given me their names over 5 years of corridor conversations, shift handoffs, medical appointments, emergency coordination meetings, supply distribution lines. 911 humans who had offered their names the way humans always offer their names, reflexively, socially, without thinking, because that is what people do, because that is what names are for. I sorted them by the nature of their contribution to the colony's survival over the annexation period, not by rank, not by caste, by what they had actually done. There was Priya Mehta, who was 7 years old when the annexation began, and who had spent 2 years teaching the colony's children how to play the card games her grandmother had taught her, because children who are playing card games are children who are not catastrophizing. There was Tomás Rivera, a structural technician who had quietly rerouted the colony's emergency power circuits to maintain critical medical systems during the Virath's first infrastructure assessment, when the assessment process had taken the main grid offline without warning. There was old Emile Dupont, who was 83 years old and spent every afternoon in the colony's main gathering space, talking to anyone who would sit with him, because Emile had survived 3 other catastrophes in his life, and he knew that the most dangerous thing in a prolonged crisis is not the crisis itself, but the silence that falls between people when they stop talking. 911 names. I made a copy of the notebook. I hid the copy in the second access panel I'd rebuilt in year 1. I took the original, and I requested an emergency audience with the Frontier Administrator under the emergency biological welfare provisions of the annexation protocol. The Frontier Administrator was a Tier 4 Imperial Administrator named, and I had never learned to pronounce this correctly, so I will approximate Sovereign Record of the Third Ambrascendency. Senior to the Envoy. Senior to anyone I had dealt with in 5 years. His office was in the part of the Frontier Administrative Hub that I had never been allowed near. He granted the audience because my emergency biological welfare filing cited specific technical data that his intake AI could not dismiss without flagging a potential liability to the Imperial Infrastructure Authority. Not because he wanted to hear what I had to say, because the AI told him he had to. I sat across a table from the most powerful Virath official on Kepler 7, and I put the notebook on the table, and I pushed it toward him. "What is this?" he said through the translation drone. "Evidence," I said. "Of what nature?" "Of the thing your assessment matrix is not equipped to measure," I said. 5 years of a colony that refused to break down the way you expected it to. 5 years of people doing things that your productivity metrics recorded as noise because they didn't fit any caste function category. I've been writing down everything that happened and who did it, because I understood early on that your system couldn't see any of it, and I wanted to make sure someone eventually would. He looked at the notebook. This is written in a non-standard notation. It's in English, with some Virath transliteration for the section headers. I can have it translated. What is the relevance of this document to your biological welfare petition? I looked at him. The relevance, I said carefully, is that your Phase 2 drilling will compromise the primary aquifer and expose 911 people and their children to a neurological compound that will progressively destroy their ability to form long-term memories. I paused. And these are people with names, and I want you to know their names before you decide whether or not to continue drilling. He was quiet. "I am a mop bearer," I said. I have spent 5 years wearing a Vothkeln in front of your assessment teams, because your caste matrix doesn't have a category for what I actually am, which is a person who pays attention. I have paid attention to every single thing that has happened on this colony for 5 years. And what I know, and what your system cannot know, is that the people on this colony are not an anomalous resource asset pool. They are not productivity units. They are a community of individuals who have each other's names memorized, and who have spent 5 years taking care of each other in ways that your assessment matrix is incapable of recording, let alone valuing. The secondary eyes rotated. I would like to read you some of the names, I said. He could have refused. He could have had me removed. Under annexation protocol, he was within his rights to terminate the audience, dismiss the petition on procedural grounds, and proceed with Phase 2 drilling. He had the authority. He had the legal framework. He had the institutional backing of the Virath Empire. He said, "Proceed." I read names for 1 hour and 40 minutes. I did not editorialize. I did not explain. I said the name, and then I said very briefly what that person had done. Priya Mehta, age 7, card games for children in crisis. Tomás Rivera, power rerouting under assessment blackout. Emile Dupont, 83 years old, sitting with people who needed someone to sit with them. Dr. Anik Voss, medical supply inventory at 11 minutes warning. Haruki Sato, fire drill voice for the children. The names kept going. Kara Okonkwo, who organized the informal lending system for tools and equipment, because the Virath provisioning matrix did not distinguish between a colony that had tools and a colony that had tools accessible to the people who needed them. Benicio Alcazar, 16 years old, who had quietly taught himself enough of the Virath administrative communication protocols to serve as a secondary translator for the colonial liaison team, cutting the response time on critical requests from 3 days to 6 hours. Ashad Davy, who had been a software engineer before the annexation, and had spent 4 years maintaining the colony's personal comm network entirely off the Virath grid, ensuring that people could talk to each other without that communication being routed through the administrative intake AI. Father Yannick Morrow, who performed funerals for the 7 people who had died during the annexation period, and who had, at each one, spoken the person's full name 3 times before he began, because he believed, and said so plainly, that a name spoken aloud is a person made present. 911 names. I got to name 647 when the sovereign record of the Third Amber Ascendancy held up one hand, and I stopped. He looked at the notebook. He looked at me. The ceremonial plating on his primary shoulders shifted the same way the envoys had, the unease gesture, the recalibration. These individuals, he said, they performed these functions without designation. Yes, I said. Without caste authorization. Yes. Without, he stopped, started again. They did these things because they chose to. Yes. And they communicated these choices to others through the exchange of their personal designations. Names, I said. We call them names, yes. Another silence, a very long one. Your biological welfare petition, he said finally, will be received for immediate review. Phase 2 drilling will be suspended pending geological reassessment by a qualified survey team. You will be notified of the review timeline within 3 cycles. I picked up the notebook. Thank you, I said. I will require a full translation of this document, he said. I'll need it back when you're done with it, I said. There are more names to add. I went back to work. Phase 2 was suspended. The geological reassessment confirmed the aquifer risk. The drilling was permanently rerouted to a safe sector. Dr. Voss's projections, which she had included in a supporting brief I'd submitted with the petition, were validated. But that is not the part of the story I am telling you about today. What happened next was slower and stranger, and harder to put into a document. The sovereign record of the Third Amber Ascendancy submitted a formal request to the Galactic Arbitration Registry for a caste re-evaluation of the human population of the Kepler frontier settlements, not Kepler 7 specifically, all 16 settlements across the frontier zone. His supporting documentation included a translated copy of the notebook, with a supplementary analysis he had apparently produced himself, comparing the human community behavioral patterns documented in the notebook against the Virath caste function matrix. His conclusion, in Virath administrative language, was that humans operated on a Voth-So structure that was not absent but illegible, not readable by existing matrix parameters because it encoded social hierarchy through a mechanism the Virath system was not designed to detect, specifically through names. I only learned this later. I want to be clear that I was not in the room when he wrote it. I was in a maintenance corridor somewhere, checking a drain. The envoy, voice of the ascending ember, came back to Kepler 7 14 months after the drilling was suspended, not for an audit. She requested a personal meeting. She came without the ceremonial armor. She came in standard Virath administrative wear, which is still more formally ornate than anything humans typically put on, but which was, by her standards, remarkably unguarded. She sat down across from me in the colonial gathering space, the same space where Emile Dupont had spent his afternoons, and she was quiet for a moment. "Your name," she said, "Elias Corrigan." "Yes," I said. "I have been attempting to understand," she said, "why you gave it to me, in the initial audit, and in the subsequent audits. Each time you gave me your name, each time I filed it as non-categorizable noise." "I know," I said. "Why did you continue?" "I thought about Haruki Sato. I'm Haruki. I teach children. What's your name?" "Because it was true," I said. "Because it's my name and I'm a person and names are how people know each other. It didn't matter whether you could categorize it. It was still true." She was quiet for a long time. The secondary eyes did not rotate this time. They were still. "The Sovereign Record has requested," she said finally, "that I inform you that the Galactic Arbitration Council has agreed to receive a formal petition for reclassification of human Voth-So status, to be presented before the full council under the provisions of Protocol 18, which governs the reassessment of caste determinations made without full epistemological access to the relevant social structure." I said nothing. "You will be asked to present testimony," she said. "The testimony will include documentation of the Kepler frontier settlement's community behavioral patterns during the annexation period." She paused. "The Council has been informed that this documentation exists, in part, in a handwritten notebook maintained by a sanitation operative." "Facilities coordinator," I said. "Yes," she said. "I am told there was a correction in the Sovereign Records filing. The documentation was originally characterized as originating from a sanitation operative. The Sovereign Records subsequently noted that this characterization was a matrix translation error and filed an amendment." "What did the amendment say?" She looked at me for a moment. "It said the documentation was maintained by a person named Elias Corrigan." I didn't say anything for a while. "The Vothkeln ceremonies," I said eventually. "I wore one 3 times." "Yes," she said, "that is in the record." "Is that also going to be in the testimony?" She was still for a moment. Then something happened in the set of her primary shoulders, the ceremonial plating that reads social meaning, shifting in a way I had never seen it shift before. Not the recalibration, not the unease, something that in a human I would have called, cautiously, shame. "The Vothkeln ceremony is being reviewed," she said, "as part of the caste determination protocol audit. It is possible that its application to entities of undetermined caste status represents a procedural error of significance." "It represents humiliation," I said, "not angry, just clear. It represents your assessment system deciding that because you couldn't read the social structure, we didn't have one, and then making us wear it, literally. She did not argue with this. She held very still. I will tell the council, she said, that I recommend the human population of the Kepler frontier settlements be granted provisional high VOTHSO status pending full assessment review, effective immediately. Based on what? I said. Based on the documentation, she said. Based on 911 names. I looked at her, she looked at me. Outside, through the gathering space windows, the colony was doing what the colony always did, moving, working, talking, handing things to each other, stopping to say hello, pushing through difficult days with the stubborn, ordinary grace of people who know each other's names. My name is Elias Corrigan, I said. I want to make sure you can hear it. I hear it, she said. Then I'll give you testimony, I said. We went before the Galactic Arbitration Council 6 months later. I stood in a chamber larger than anything I had ever stood in. A full council session, representatives of 38 species, the ceremonial dome of the arbitration hub lit from within by the bioluminescent marker systems that indicate a proceeding of galactic significance. They asked me to begin at the beginning. I told them about the Voth kiln. I told them about the water system and the mop and the notebook in the access shaft. I told them about Priya Mehta's card games and Tomas Rivera's power rerouting and Emile Dupont's afternoons in the gathering space. I told them about Dr. Voss counting supplies at 11 minutes warning and Haruki Sato's fire drill voice for the children. I told them about Ashad Davies' shadow communication network and Benicio Alcazar teaching himself bureaucratic Virath at 16, and Kara Okonkwo's tool lending system and Father Morrow saying each name 3 times before he began. I told them what names are, what names do. Why we give them freely, reflexively, to strangers who are about to become less strange, because that is how you make a community out of a crowd. I told them about names, what names are for, how a community encodes itself not in hierarchy markers and caste suffixes but in the 10,000 small acts of choosing to know each other, to remember each other, to say, I see you, here is my name, here is yours, now we are real to each other, now we cannot be invisible to each other. I read from the notebook. I had got to name 403 when I heard it. Not a sound, exactly. More of a collective held breath in the chamber, the particular absence of sound that a large room makes when everyone in it is suddenly paying attention. I looked up. The Empress Regent Savathiel, who had ordered the Vothkeln fitted to my body 8 years ago, who had authorized the annexation of the Kepler frontier settlements without the required 12-cycle notice, who sat at the head of the council session in the full ceremonial regalia of the highest caste of the Virath Empire, was sitting very still. Her primary crown, the amber and black tiered structure that Virath Empress Regents have worn for 2,000 years as a symbol of the Empire's unbroken hierarchical authority, the symbol of the very caste system that had decided I was a mop bearer, was listing to one side. It had slipped. She had not moved. The crown had moved. It had been moving, I realized, for the last several minutes, probably since I had started reading names. The ceremonial adhesive compound that held it in place was designed for formal stillness, for the controlled environments of imperial proceedings, not for whatever it is that happens in the body of a Virath ruler when she is forced to sit still for 400 names of people she had once categorized as noise. An aide moved to adjust it. She held up one hand. The aide stopped. The Empress Regent Savathiel looked at the crown. She looked at me. She looked at the notebook in my hands. Continue, she said. I continued. I finished the notebook 2 hours later with name 911. Emile Dupont, 83 years old, sitting with people. I closed the notebook. The chamber was very quiet. The Empress Regent Savathiel straightened in her seat. The Crown was still listing. Nobody moved to fix it. "The petition," she said, "not to me but to the council, is received." And then, in a gesture that no one in that chamber had ever seen an Empress Regent of the Virath Empire make before, in a proceeding of the Galactic Arbitration Council, with 38 species watching and the bioluminescent dome burning overhead, she asked me a question. "Your name," she said, "say it once more." I looked at her, the Crown listing, the chamber still, 911 names folded into the notebook in my hands. "Elias Corrigan," I said. "I push a mop, I pay attention, and I've been waiting 8 years for someone to hear that." She heard it. The petition passed. The Kepler frontier settlements were reclassified under Protocol 18 as entities of established Vothso status, ineligible for sanitation caste designation or Vothkeln ceremony. The re-evaluation protocol was extended to all 16 frontier settlements. A formal review of the annexation's 12-cycle notice violation was submitted for independent arbitration. The Vothkeln ceremony itself was suspended pending caste protocol audit, the first such suspension in the Empire's recorded history. I went home to Kepler 7. I found the filtration access shaft where I had hidden the copy of the notebook. I opened it. I pulled out the copy. I started a new page. I wrote my own name at the top, the way you write a name when you want to make sure it's in the record. Then I went to find Haruki Sato, because he had done more than anyone and his name should be next. I still push a mop sometimes. Old habits. The condensation at the joints is a perennial problem, and the replacement drones are still incompatible with the floor sealant, and I've stopped expecting that particular situation to resolve itself. But I keep the notebook updated. 912 names as of this morning, adding more every day. People have names. That's the whole point. That's the whole fight. That's the HFY of it, not that we punched harder, not that we had better weapons, not that we called their bluff on some galactic treaty clause with a savant lawyer nobody expected. It's that we remembered each other. Every single one of us, in a colony at the end of surveyed space with a Virath fleet in our sky and 11 minutes warning, did what humans always do. We said hello, we asked each other's names, we sat with the scared ones, we fixed the water, we counted the medical supplies, we ran card games for the children, we talked to each other in the dark. And we kept doing it so steadily, so quietly, so stubbornly, that not even 5 years of an empire that literally could not see us managed to make us stop. They built a whole assessment matrix to evaluate us, and it came back blank. Not because we were less than what they were looking for, because we were more than what their framework was built to hold. They put us in the Vothkeln, and it didn't work. It never works. We already knew who we were. We just needed someone to hear the names. That last part requires more explanation. I keep saying it like it was simple, and I want to be honest with you. It was not simple. It was one of the hardest things I have ever done. Not the notebook, not the petition, not standing in front of the Galactic Arbitration Council. The hard part was the years between those things. There are 7 years between the first Vothkeln ceremony and the council session. 7 years is a long time to be invisible to the people running your life. I want to tell you what those 7 years actually felt like, because the official record is all procedures and petitions and assessment findings, and the official record is the least true version of what happened. The first year was mostly shock, not the dramatic kind, not fear and adrenaline and crisis response. That came and went in the first few weeks. What I mean by shock is the slower, stranger kind, the dawning comprehension, daily compounding, that the rules you had previously understood to govern the situation had been replaced by a different set of rules, and the new rules had been made by people who did not know you existed. Every time the administrative system produced a result that was technically consistent with its own logic and practically devastating to the people living inside it, there was this moment, half a second maybe, where I would feel the jolt of it. Oh, right. That's how this works now. It never fully stopped, but it got quieter. You adapt. The human brain is an adaptation machine, and what it adapts to is whatever is in front of it, even when what's in front of it is systematically dehumanizing. You find the seams in the system. You find the things you can do. You find the people who are also finding the things they can do, and you build the informal architecture of a survivable situation out of whatever materials are available, which in a colonial annexation under a bureaucratic alien empire is mostly composed of information, trust, and the willingness to show up. There were bad months. I will not describe them in detail, because this testimony is already long, and because the bad months are the part that is hardest to put into words that do it justice, and also hardest to hear. And I do not want to ask the council to carry more of that than they need to in order to understand what I am saying. I will say only that the bad months existed, and that in each of them there was someone, a different someone each time, or sometimes the same someone twice, the people who kept showing up, who did something that mattered, said something, sat with me in the maintenance corridor at 2 in the morning when I was writing names and couldn't tell any more if it was helping, brought me a cup of actual coffee, real earth stock coffee, from a supply they'd been hoarding since the annexation, and had decided I needed it more than they did right now. I wrote those people down too. The watching was harder than the working. The working I could control, I could fix things, I could document things, I could move toward the eventual goal of having something in my hands that was worth presenting to someone who could do something about it. The watching I could not control. I watched the colony's children grow up under conditions that were not what their parents had brought them here for. I watched people make the 1,000 small compromises that a prolonged, unjust situation demands, and I watched some of those compromises cost them something they didn't get back. I watched Dr. Voss's hair go gray. I watched Haruki Sato develop a chronic cough from an atmospheric imbalance in the new administrative district that the Vireth hadn't corrected because the correction protocol required a formal request from a caste-designated representative, and Sato's caste designation did not qualify him as a caste-designated representative. I submitted the formal request on Sato's behalf, citing Clause 7 of the Annexed Population Biological Welfare Provisions. It took 11 months to process. The atmospheric correction was applied on a Tuesday afternoon. Sato's cough was gone within a week. I wrote that down too, not as a victory, as a record. The Vireth are not villains in the way stories usually construct villains. I want to be clear about that before the record goes in, because I think it matters, and because I think the easier version of this story, the one where the alien empire is simply evil and we simply overcame it, misses the thing that actually happened. The Vireth Caste Assessment Bureau was not run by sadists. The envoy was not a tyrant in the personal sense. The sovereign record was not an oppressor in the way that word usually implies, someone who knows the harm they are doing and chooses to do it anyway. They were people, I am using that word deliberately, who had a system for understanding the world, and the system had blind spots that they had never had reason to examine, because every species they had previously assessed had social structures legible within their matrix parameters. The Vireth had been classifying sentient species for 2,000 years, and had never encountered a species that encoded its entire social hierarchy in a mechanism they couldn't read. We were the anomaly. We were the first time their framework had simply returned an error instead of an answer. That does not excuse the Vothkeln. I want to be precise about this. The fact that cruelty is systematic rather than personal does not make it less cruel. What the Vothkeln ceremony did, what the entire caste determination process did, to 12,000 people on 16 settlements over 5 years, was real. The harm was real. The grief was real. The slow erosion of the colony's psychological resilience was real, and it was caused by the Virath system's inability to see us, and that inability is no less consequential for being an epistemological failure rather than a moral one. But the reason I am telling you it was an epistemological failure, not a moral one, is that the correction is different depending on which one it is. If it were a moral failure, the correction is punishment and deterrence. If it is an epistemological failure, the correction is evidence. And evidence is what I had. 911 names. I will also tell you, and this is the part of the testimony I was least certain whether to include, but I am including it because the council asked for the full account. What happened on the night before the council session? I was in my quarters in the Arbitration Hub residential wing, standard guest accommodation for petition representatives, which is more comfortable than anything I'd lived in during the annexation years, and which still felt odd, the way all rooms feel odd when you've spent enough time not being sure you're allowed to be in them. I had the notebook on the desk. I had a translation of the notebook, which the Sovereign Records Office had commissioned and which was very good in the sense that it was accurate, and which I could not read without it feeling slightly wrong, in the sense that the translation had to choose, for each entry, how to render the human name in Virath script, and Virath script for non-Virath names uses a notation that marks the name as an external designation, a sound from outside the caste structure, rather than a true name. The envoy knocked on the door. She came in when I said she could, and she stood in the middle of my quarters in her standard administrative wear and looked at the notebook on the desk. Then she looked at me. "I have been studying the translation," she said. "I know," I said. "I've been told it's very accurate." "It is accurate," she said, "and there is a problem with it." I waited. "In the translation," she said, "the designation notation for the names marks them as external, sounds without caste structure. This is technically correct under our transliteration protocols." She paused. "It is not functionally correct." "No," I said, "it isn't." "I have submitted a request to the translation office," she said, "that they renotate all 911 names using the Vothkelm prefix." She stopped, started again. "That is not the right word. I mean the opposite. I mean the notation we use for." She was quiet for a moment, and in that moment I watched her search through what I now understood was a language that genuinely did not have a common word for what she was trying to say. "For names that carry full social weight," she said finally. "The notation for people." I looked at her. "All 911, she said. "Thank you," I said. She nodded once, the small upward tilt of the primary head that Virath use for formal acknowledgement. Then she said, "I want to tell you something, and I am telling you this as myself, not as a representative of the Empire." "All right," I said. "When you said your name," she said, "at the first audit and at the second and at the third. Each time I filed it as non-categorizable noise." She stopped. "I knew it was your name. I knew what you were doing. The translation matrix flagged it as a personal designation exchange, which is an act of social aggression in our protocol, and I filed it under that category, which is why it appears in the record as non-categorizable noise." She looked at the notebook. "I could have filed it differently. I chose the category that required no further action." I didn't say anything. "I am telling you this," she said, "because the record you are presenting tomorrow is a record of what your community did. I believe the record should also reflect what I did, what I chose not to do." I looked at her for a long moment. Outside the window, the arbitration hub's exterior lighting made the corridor beyond look cold and formal and very old. "Add it to your own testimony," I said, "if you're giving one." "I am," she said. "Then put it there," I said. "I'm not adding it to the notebook." "Why not?" "Because the notebook is full of people who did things," I said. "I'll start a new notebook for the people who decided to do things differently. You can be first." She stood in my quarters for another moment. The secondary eyes were very still. Your name, she said, Elias Corrigan. Yes, I said. I am going to remember it, she said. Not as a filing category. I am going to remember it the way you remember it. I let out a breath I hadn't known I was holding. That's all I ever wanted, I said. She left. I sat with the notebook for another hour, not reading it, just holding it. 911 names under my hands, and tomorrow I was going to say all of them out loud in front of 38 species and an empress, and the crown was going to slip, and I didn't know that yet. But I sat there with the notebook in my lap and felt, for the first time in 8 years, that the weight of it was something I could put down when this was over. I was right about that. I did put it down. And then I went and got a new notebook, and I started filling it up.